This is Troy McGuinness, and you're listening to the Agile Uprising podcast.
Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Jay Hersko. Join me once again. I have two of my good friends, the regular contingent. First, from scenic Southern Georgia, we have Mr. Mike Cadell.
Howdy, y'all.
And calling in from the frozen tundra that is New England right now, Mr. Ben Young. Ben?
Evening, gentlemen.
Man, you're really taking liberties with the definition of the term gentleman. No offense, Mike.
I've never been accused.
I've been called a lot of things in my life. Gentleman's not one of them. So, Mike, I'm going to pass the baton to you to talk about where the genesis of this episode actually comes from.
Sure. So a few episodes back, there was a Agile Uprising podcast with Gene Gindel about organizational enablers. And Jay, you mentioned something in that that was not part of the series. And when you said it, I was out for my morning walk and it came to me immediately. Jay, Ben, and I could just absolutely go to town with this idea. And what you said was you poked at something that it's the idea of people think I need to stick around and I need to get promoted. And the agency that comes with us as employees, and you quoted Kenny Rogers, and it's like, we give people advice, or is it just heuristics? And sometimes people stick around too long, and why is it? And why do we stay someplace instead of moving on, or why do we move on and not stay someplace? And
Perfect. And for those that didn't get the reference, the reason why I used Kenny Rogers, it's the gambler, where the chorus is you need to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, and know when to run. And that advice really can translate to a lot of people's careers. I know there's a lot of tumult right now, however you want to say that word, in the agile adjacent space. We have PMI buying AA,
Dogs Anonymous.
Agile Alliance. We get dogs and cats living together. It's kind of insane out there, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that we don't need to think about our own agency when it comes to our own careers.
Yeah.
And the three of us have been different places. We've bounced, we've bounced jobs because the vibe changed. We've bounced jobs because we've had poor leaders. We've ended up reorged under leaders we don't like. And I also think I would argue that I don't know you two guys' opinions, but I know myself personally, I've definitely left the job too soon, if I'm being honest. There's times I've pulled a ripcord and I probably should have stuck around and watched the tides go out. But let's start with, and Mike, you actually started out with, you actually have a quote in here from, I believe it's Morpheus, which, man, you want to talk about how resonant The Matrix is, right? It's still one of the rare movies that holds up really, really well, right? Morpheus's quote is, you have to understand I'm not going to do a Larry Fishburne voice. You have to understand most of these people are not ready to be unplugged, and many of them are so inured, so hopelessly dependent on the system that they will fight to protect it. So when I read that, the first thing I thought of was the iron law of institutions, right? Where on a long enough timeline, a bureaucracy goes to the point where Ben and I work in a company where we're not protecting the company. We're not protecting the company's interests. We're not even fighting for the customers. We're fighting for our role in the system that we've created in the bureaucracy that's making our lives go forward. Does that sound insane, Ben, or does that sound about right?
I think it sounds about right. I think there's a big disconnect that happens when that's the case, right? Like this sounds a little bit harsh, but I feel like there's a selfishness involved in that, right? Like if you find yourself in a place that is kind of surviving just for the sake of surviving, and the system is just thriving, and everyone's kind of just looking out to get their piece of it, that becomes a real problem, right? And you mentioned caring about the customer. That's when people stop caring about the customer. And that's when I think people's kind of risk calculus in their head goes from being like, what can I do to grow and to learn new things and to contribute more, towards being more, how do I kind of cut out as big of a piece of this pie for myself as I possibly can. So I think this all goes along well with the Parkinson's law thing. And yeah, it's just all bad vibes all around, right? Like it's putting your head in that headspace as opposed to something a little bit more ambitious and proactive.
And so, Jay, along the lines of what you were talking about, my first big boy job out of college was as a software developer for the New Jersey Treasury Department. So back in that day, we were called programmers. Um, and um, I recall my dad was uh, a state DOT employee for 37 years, civil engineer, designed half the highways in northern Jersey. And
Oh, so that's who's to blame. Okay,
yeah,
fair
absolutely. um, and I recall about 2.5, 3 years into the job, I started to look around, and it felt like, now when I look back at it, it felt like I was in the Matrix, because there were people who were lifers, if you will, that just it was just part of the system, just going along to get along, and had accepted a level of stagnation and mediocrity. And there were some people in the state government who were just awesome, who 35 years later, they're still busting their tail to try to do the best service they can for the public. But the weight of the system was crushing on me. And I was just like, all right, it's been 5 years. I got to get the blue blazes out of here. And then I went to work for a brokerage firm. So talk about
Yeah, right. Talk about a change. Well, so I want to come back to the 5 year thing, but why, Mike? I'm going to start with you, and then I'm going to swing it to Ben. Why do you think people stick around in a job for quote unquote too long, realizing that too long is in the eye of the beholder, right?
Yeah.
But why? I mean, we've all encountered people who have I I don't say too long. My term is they're here past their sell by date. So what? Why do you think people do that?
Um, there's varied reasons. As in thinking about this topic, I was drawn immediately to the time when I read the book "Quit" by Annie Duke, and there's a lot which she quotes the same Kenny Rogers song, by the way. But at the core of it, I think, is probably a couple things. There's one thing very cultural, that there's a perception that quitting is weak, and that only you got to be strong, you got to stick with it, you got to persevere. But it's really just two different sides of the same decision, and there's a cultural programming. I suspect there's also a bias in the employment market, that it may in generations after mine. I'm a tail end of the boomer generation. My generation was like the golden watch in 50 and 30, 40 years, but you don't want to be a job hopper. Now job hopper is not quite as common a stigma, but there's still some of that culturally programmed. And there's just this thing about people thinking they're giving up as opposed to making a different choice. That's one of the predominant things, but not all.
I do want to come back to, we could probably do an entire episode on the difference of generational norms outlooks on what your resume looks like, right? The whole stick with it, gold watch and pension versus the why have you stuck with it for so long that maybe some of the younger generations are coming up against. Ben, I'm going to throw it to you. Why do you think people stick around jobs for quote unquote too long?
Yeah, so I mean, I'd add to the culture thing in particular, and there's different dimensions to this. Like you just mentioned the age thing and how that plays into it. I also think geography is part of it too, in terms of culture. So let's just throw some random city out there. Let's say Hartford, for example, right? Hartford is the insurance capital of the world. There's plenty of places to work if you're really into insurance, or if that's sort of your jam, right? But that said, it's all very similar culturally. It's very much, I mean, maybe growing out of it a little bit, but probably one of the last places to grow out of that 30 years in a gold watch culture that you just mentioned, Mike. So it's a very different thing than being an engineer in Silicon Valley, right? If that's the case, it's like, why on earth would you stay anywhere for any significant amount of time if there's some sort of better opportunity out there? And another geographical example is in the United Kingdom, for example, you'd meet plenty of young people getting tons of incredible exposure at all these great companies. And a huge reason for that was that there was less friction to actually leaving or being unemployed or switching companies. Because you didn't have to worry about things like your health insurance, right? Like the NHS kind of had you covered on that front. So there's different kind of cultural and geographical aspects. I also think these are, you know, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush because I think sometimes these do really work out in people's favor. But different sort of like prizes, right? Like, you know, 401k invests after 2, 3, 4, however many years, or my stock options vest after this time. All those different things, sometimes they really matter, and sometimes they're just these milestones that we kind of like tell ourselves in our head. And like maybe if you actually wrote the math out, it's like, well, maybe that doesn't make that much sense. But it provides kind of an excuse, right? It's like, well, you know, after once my 401k vests, then I can leave.
Right. It's the self-rationalization part of it. Yeah.
That kind
Right.
of the escalation of commitment almost.
Yes. Yeah. Hey, bringing in the term. Yes, exactly. An escalation of commitment. I also to add another term like loss aversion, right? And I think people are more worried about, and this comes down to risk, right? Are people more worried about, you know, what they might gain in also not just financially, but all sorts of other ways, what they might gain from a different and new experience, and how kind of plentiful those experiences are around them, as opposed to losing what they have right now, which is kind of a known quantity, and not just again, not just something quantifiable, but sort of your identity kind of wrapped into
Right.
your current team, your situation, et cetera. And
It's
when
one
it
of the
comes,
hardest things for somebody to quit is their identity.
yes, yeah. And if you, I don't think it's something that happens intentionally, but I do think that most people, if they care at all about their job, it's hard not to have your identity wrapped into it, even if it is extremely frustrating. And if you're in a tough spot where it's hard to make progress, if you put calories into it, like your identity is going to be into it to some extent, even accidentally. The last thing I'll say about risk, though, is that I do think just in general, people are probably not as risk avert or don't have enough of an appetite for risk as they should. And I met this sort of executive coach person at a conference once, who said the difference between the A players and the B players is tolerance for risk. And it was in a conversation about me and my tolerance for risk and how I wasn't being very tolerant of it. So that one really got me thinking. And it kind of goes along with the Bruce Arians quote, "No risk it, no biscuit." So we could probably all use a little bit more of that.
So Jay, Ben, along that line, I'm working my way through reading Master. What's the name of it?
The leadership.
Mastering leadership.
Yeah. And one of the key elements that they bring out in this book is the difference between the well-performing leaders and the lower performing leaders is playing to win versus playing not to lose. And so, you know, as you're talking, I was thinking about that as like, to some extent, maybe somebody's playing not to lose, not judging it. That may be the thing that's appropriate for that person. Don't want to, you know, be judgy, but
Yeah.
you know, there's
When you play not to lose, you're the coach that never goes for it on fourth down, and we've seen how that this past weekend. We see how that ends up.
Yeah,
right?
very
Like,
timely.
And people. I mean, we're getting the world's worst Super Bowl right now. I'm rooting for the asteroid. One of the things. So when you talk, interesting turn of phrase though, when you talk about playing not to lose versus playing to win. That could, in certain respects, that can be beneficial. And the two most famous examples I can give are Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant. Because Michael Jordan famously in many interviews has said it's not that he likes winning. It's not that he loves winning. He loathes losing more than anything in the world. And he hates the way he feels. So everything he does, all of that tenacity is because he hates losing way more than he enjoys winning. Kobe Bryant famously the same way, which, I mean, there's something to be said that's, I mean, it's almost monomaniacal in approach, but I could see where, I can see where there's some benefit to that. So,
Yeah,
Mike, go on.
real quick, Jay, on the topic of why people maybe don't leave, there's another element that we've kind of nibbled around, just want to call it out. There are some people who are in conditions where the job they have, suck as it may, gives them a wage that they need for whatever situation they're in. And back to Ben's point of geography, perhaps, there's nothing else, in their life situation at that moment that will give them the financial resources to do. Like, I know somebody who lives in a smaller size city in the southeast who works in a place that's, that person would rather not work there, but is taking care of multiple extended family members and is the sole breadwinner for the extended family. And there's really no other good paying options in that city, and that person for family situations can't leave. So there are some like that, and then there's some who imagine that's the case when it's really not.
Right. And
That's a
that
good
second
point.
one is the dangerous one, right? The false sense of, well, I need to stay. And believe it, let me throw this out there. There's a quote from the movie SLC Punk. I want to talk about an odd reference, where the Matthew Lillard is fighting with his dad. I forget who his dad is. I forget the actor who plays him. I think it's actually the guy who plays Shooter McGavin, if I remember correctly, from Happy Gilmore. And at one point he says to his son, he says, I didn't sell out, son. I bought in. And there are times in your life where maybe buying in is the right move. Mike, you brought up Annie Duke and Quit. One of the was when we talked about having this episode, one of the first things I thought of was David Epstein's Range, which is one of the books that changed my life. I tell everybody, every chance I get a copy of that book. Maybe it'll change your life like it changed mine. And he had a whole chapter on the idea of having too much grit. And he talked about Vincent van Gogh, how this guy was a failure in everything he tried to do. Like, he literally was. He was a salesman, and he was a printer. He helped his uncle. I think it was in a print shop, if I remember correctly. And he was a painter. He got no notoriety when he was alive. All of his fame came post-mortem, right? All of his fame came after he died. And Epstein talks about there is a degree of fit between ability and proclivity. And his exact quote was, "It's under the idea of match quality, the aegis of match quality, right? Is what my ability matching my proclivity." And his one-liner was, "If we treated careers more like dating, nobody would settle down so quickly." And I thought that was a very, very insightful take. He even says, "Winners never quit and quitters never win" is a terrible idea. And his next line is, "One of the most important life skills we all should develop is the willingness to jettison," which is about your, two sides of the same coin. Am I painting myself an unrealistic picture where sometimes you are better off just, time to go. Like your example, Mike, that you started with, you said you were at the company 5 years. I go back to, whether you love him or hate him, Malcolm Gladwell and Blink, 10,000 hours. 5 years at a job is 10,000 hours of work time, with an average of $2,000 hours a year. If you have not either progressed or moved into something new or moved into something better, it's time to skedaddle, because you're basically, where you are is where you are, because technically you have mastered what you're trying to do. And I use that. I've hopefully there's none of the interns that have ever used me as a mentor listening to this, but I've always told them, like, after 5 years, if you're still in the same spot treading water, it's time to go. You got to go over, up, or out, because you're not doing yourself any favors.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the points I remember from reading Quit was that success lies in picking the right things, not just sticking to things. But there's an opportunity cost to both stick-to-itiveness and to quitting. So it's really more of a forecasting problem. So do you choose to move on or to stay? You're forecasting future gains and future losses. So based on the
Yeah.
data points you have and the conditions, and and unfortunately we can't run Monte Carlo simulations on different jobs, I guess. I don't know, maybe we can. See if Troy's got something like that.
But it's the thinking behind it that matters, right? Like
Right.
think, even if you don't have the data set, like thinking about every decision as a forecast. And if you had some sort of non-data driven, but still at least thinking about it as some sort of like, well, which one's more likely to work out? Which one has the higher upside? Which one has the lower downside? All these
One
things
of
are valuable ways to think about it, even if you don't have the data.
one of the heuristics that I've used over my long and not very illustrious career has been, I get to a point where I'm starting to feel like, is this still the place for me to be or not? And I ask myself honestly, a year from now, what is the probability that you will be somewhat happy, somewhat fulfilled in your current role or whatever role you will be in if you don't act? And if that comes down below 40%, Mike's heuristic, not to say this is for anybody, and it's a heuristic, it's not a formula. If the probability is below 40%, probably time to
go.
look to see. And sometimes you see, you know what? I was wrong. It's not as bad here as I thought it was.
It's very much ties into when someone makes up their mind to leave, you never accept the counteroffer. Never accept the counteroffer. Like this is career 101 right here. Like if you make up your mind to go, if I work for Ben and I say this guy's an idiot, I can't work for this guy anymore, and I make up my mind to leave, and I interview and I get a job with Mike's company, and I tell Ben, I'm leaving, I'm going to work for Mike. And Ben says, well, how about if I give you an extra 10, 20, 30 grand to stay? How about I give you stock options? Whatever. You never stay. It's like what is it? The three doors, to one of them as a Camaro and the other as a goat.
Yeah.
Right. Like, and if you guess wrong, statistically, you need to change your guess. Right.
Yes.
If you pick A and there's nothing behind A, and and they open B, you have to change. Right. Like, I think it comes down to once you've made up your mind to leave, you've steeled yourself emotionally to say, I need to go and interview and I need to get out of here. You are doing yourself you would be doing yourself a disservice by accepting the counter. And statistically, what is it, 60, 70% of the time, those people leave within a year anyway.
Yeah.
Because what pissed you off was probably not money. We can go into the Daniel Pink autonomy, mastery, purpose stuff, but what pissed you off was probably something else, and it isn't going to get rectified with a little bit more money in your pocket.
Yeah.
So
unless the counter was we're going to change the working conditions.
Yes. And even
which is very rare.
Yes, even then I would be very, very skeptical. I had true story. I had a point once in my career where I had a full-time gig with this company, and I had slowly but surely climbed the ranks. I was fairly well respected. The workload was heinous. But I was doing a good enough job, and I got an offer to take another job as a consultant. It was more money, but it was just change of pace, totally different world. And I called the most successful person I know, which is one of my mom's friends from college. And I said to her, I'm doing well at company A, but company B gave me an offer. What do I do? And the advice she gave to me, which I have paid forward to any intern, anyone that's ever asked, is if you are as good as you say you are, or as you think you are, you owe it to yourself to take the new opportunity, because as long as you don't burn the bridge at the first place, they will always have you back if you really are that good. Meaning, if I'm as good as I say I am, I owe it to myself to try this new thing, because there will always be the safety of the old thing in the back of my mind. That's always an option. And that advice, knock on wood, has served me well.
It's almost like a pseudo two-way door that helps you kind of get over the mental hump of actually taking the leap.
Yes. Ben, I'm going to put you on the spot. Have you ever quit a job too early in hindsight? Left a place where in hindsight you went, I probably could have stuck it out.
No, not at all. I mean, you mentioned that, and I'm like, are you nuts? That has never happened to me. There's one job that I do regret leaving in the sense that it was the best job I ever had, and I didn't want to leave it that soon. But there's just a series of life circumstances that led to me departing. So I don't know if that counts. But by and large, and I feel like I've had kind of a lot of jobs for the length of my career so far. I've never felt like I've left early. I've always kind of felt once I got, and I don't like I get nervous, I get anxious about it. I worry about all this stuff, but once I'm kind of settled into the new place, I'm almost always thinking, oh, it was a good thing to move on, if nothing else for personal growth.
Okay. How about you, Mike? You ever pull a trigger too soon in hindsight?
There's one time I left the job and the next gig turned out to be no different in many ways than the prior one. And had I stayed at that prior one for another 6 months and toughed it out, might have turned, in hindsight, it might have turned out to be not quite as bad. But other than that, nah. The vast majority of the time, speaking from my own personal experience and people that I've talked with this about, we wait too long to leave.
Yeah.
And again, going back to Annie Duke's writing, it's because when you're in the losses, you'll keep the sunk cost fallacy. I'll keep going a little bit longer, coupled with the, I don't want to be seen as a quitter, and you know, you know, stiff upper lip,
Right.
stick with it. And so that my lived experience has been, I tend to stick a little longer than maybe I should have. And there's times where I think, well, am I jumping too quickly? Am I leaving
Right.
too soon? And what I've learned over time, there were times where maybe, but if I'm running to something instead of running away from something, then it feels right.
Gotcha.
If you're just like, any port in a storm, get me the blue blazes out of here. I did that once, got into the worst job in my life. And a year in, my wife said to me, "You're going to stay home for a year. I'm going back to work." And I had a year off, best job of my life. Staying home with my kids when they were 3 and 5 years old.
Oh, I
Nice.
can't imagine. That's fantastic. I guess I'm the outlier here. And let me, I'm going to give a little bit of color. I'm going to change names to protect the innocent and the guilty. I worked for Company X. There was a lot of upheaval in the management layers, and I bolted and I took another job. And the job that I bolted to, it was really rough for the first year, too. Right, until I finally really settled in. And in hindsight, I had more, to quote Mr. Reinertson, I had more optionality at the first company than I realized. I could have called an old boss that I worked for who was still there. I could have done a little bit more work around finding a way to find a spot for me in this company, because I liked working for the company, all things considered, but it was time for me to go. And in hindsight, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had made that call and said, hey, instead of calling this boss to say I'm giving my notice, I called this boss to say, hey, do you have anything for me? Because I need to make a change. Now, granted, everything, my life has worked out, knock on wood, where it's supposed to be, and all that stuff. But there are times where I think, I guess my advice to anyone who's listening is check your options. You might have more optionality than you think. Sit down with a piece of paper and just kind of ruminate on it, not for too long, like Mike said, but yeah, I think maybe my life would have been a little bit different. My career would have been a little bit different if I stuck around. I don't know. I will say that the sign that I will tell anyone that it is time to quit your job and get the hell out of Dodge is when you're taking 3 Tylenol PMs on a Sunday because the thought of going to work on Monday, you absolutely dread it. I was there at one point in my career. I will never get to that again.
Yeah, that's too late.
Yeah, yeah,
Yes.
right. Like I was out of sick days by May for the year. Sick and vacation. Yeah,
that's rough.
Yeah, it was terrible.
But yeah, Jay, back to that point, making a decision like this, we're making it on imperfect information. No matter which way you go, you're making it on imperfect information. So, along with that, advice I would offer is be calm, cool, and rational. Make your decision, and then just don't second guess it.
Right.
Once you made the decision, put your heart into fulfilling the decision that you made. Because if you're looking back and kind of second guessing yourself, then number one, you're going to be miserable, likely, and number two, you're not going to be doing your best at whatever path you've chosen.
Yeah, and that's right. And to be truthful, the job that I bounced to actually turned out to not be a bad gig. I, and it's not that I made peace with it. It's that the landscape changed and the opportunity changed, and it became something more pleasurable and more interesting to me, more usage to my skills. But for a while there, I was looking in the mirror like, what the hell did I do?
I, Mike, you just triggered a thought of because you're talking about the sunk cost fallacy, right? And we're always talking about throwing good money after bad,
Bad.
right? But in this case, it's really more like throwing good future time after bad past time, right? And
Yeah.
like we all
What's more
we have
valuable than time?
Yeah.
well,
Nothing.
yeah, exactly. Like so, exactly like what came to mind. I don't know if you guys have seen like I think it's Tim Urban or whatever. He's got that like it's mostly pictures, a blog showing like how many. It's kind of along the lines of the 4,000 week thing, like how many
Yes.
weeks you have
Yes.
to live, if you live like far away from your parents, how many more times are you realistically going to see them, like before somebody unfortunately passes or whatever. Like it just really puts things in perspective of like how much time we actually have. And so if you think about things like you were saying of the sunk cost fallacy of like we only have so much time in this world, in our careers, how much of it are we going to spend throwing bad time after or good time after bad in a situation that's not really worth it.
Yeah. Well said.
And I mean, the truth of it is, you never know. Hindsight is always 20/20, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So,
Great point.
I mean, and I am man enough to admit that maybe that one I zigged or I should have zagged. But at the same time, I'm also creating, to quote Mr. Snowden, or no, it's not Snowden, it's Nassim Taleb. Um, we create our own historical narrative when we look back on the facts that we choose to remember. So maybe it was that bad and I don't remember. Maybe it was better than I thought it was, but I was viewing it through rose-colored glasses. Well, I'll never know. But definitely our perceptions and how we maintain those memories definitely tie into that decision-making process. The importance of getting out of yourself, right? Um, to Mike's point, right? Thinking long and hard about it. You have a note in here, Mike. You were talking about when you're looking at a new gig or when you're thinking about leaving, making a list of the things you will and will not tolerate, and that made me think of in Range. She talks about consistency of interest. So is this aligned with the direction I would like to see myself going in? Knowing that I don't know where I'm going to land, event like long term, none of us ever know. But it is those two things definitely tie into play where when you get down to the why the X or O part of the decision.
Yeah. And that, just to elaborate a bit on that, what are you willing to tolerate and not willing to tolerate? Um, I don't remember where it comes from, but there's a thought adjacent to that is that um, an organization's culture is defined in large part by what it's willing to tolerate.
Yes, yes, yes. Not what they say it is, but what behavior is tolerated. Yes, yes.
Yeah, and I've been having this conversation with myself here recently about what what person X and person Y are doing, and is that tolerated or is that not, and how does that align to what I'm willing to tolerate or not? And it's it gets down to kind of the essence level of reality. It's not the mechanics at the consensus.
Mm-hmm.
It's down into the essence.
Right, right.
And that's where the true satisfaction and uh, uh, happiness and energy comes from, is when you're in a place where your interest and your what you're willing to tolerate lines up closely enough with what your
Right.
organization is willing to tolerate.
Right. Right. I had one of the rare moments of quotability I've had in my career is I had an intern call me. Actually, it was a student. Student called me, took a job with the company. It was at a Wall Street-esque firm, high frequency trading. And he's very young, so he is a Gen, I guess he's a millennial, right? Very young, just graduating college, getting out into the world. And no, because Alpha's still in high school, right? Yeah, he's not an alpha, he's a millennial. And he said to me, I'm working at this company and I'm making good money, but I'm not really doing anything positive with the world. And I said, well, what do you mean? He's like, well, it's rent extraction. He's a bright kid, very bright kid, dual major, very, very bright kid. And he said, I'm working for this company and I'm making somebody else rich and I'm making some money, but I'm not really changing the world, making it better. What do I do? Like, is this going to be my lot in life that I'm always going to work for other companies where if I want to make money, I have to go work in a company that's probably involved in something that may be slightly morally objectionable, if not antithetical to what I think is important in the world. Because he was talking about how if I work for an NGO, I work for a nonprofit, I can do the good things in the world, but I'm not going to make any money because they typically historically don't pay well. And the rare moment of insight I had, this is one of my last three brain cells fighting. One of them, the smart one, won in this instance. I said to him, I said, I understand what you're saying, but think about it this way. And I gave you the example where I had a job where I was a manager, and in 3 years I promoted two people, and the third one, I trained this person up to take my job, and I took a different role. So they went from an individual contributor to a manager role. And I said to this student, I said, so think about that story. I said, I'm working for a large international conglomerate. I am not making the world a better place. But those three people, I made their lives and their worlds infinitely better by me doing what I was trying to do, me doing my job. So I said, that's the win that I'm looking at it as I watch our stock price do something and all the negative stories in the news. I think to myself, yeah, but these three people, I actually changed their lives. So I found the diamond in the turd, I guess.
Yeah.
Huh?
You ever see the graduation speech Admiral McRaven gave at University of Texas?
Mm-mm.
What you were saying kind of goes right along with it. Basically, he extrapolated the math and said, this graduating class, you'll affect this number of people who will affect that number of people and that number of people. And pretty soon University of Texas is going to change the whole world. Bit of graduation speech hyperbole, but you're in good company, Jay, with that thought.
I want that to go into posterity somewhere. It's probably the most intelligent thing I've ever said. Nothing of that magnitude is ever going to come out of my mouth again. But that was my one claim to fame. All right, so we're quickly approaching on time. Ben, any final thoughts when it comes to when to quit and when to stick? I mean, we could honestly go on for another hour. We haven't even touched on the generational differences in job hopping and opinions. Any other final thoughts, Ben, if you wanted to pass on something to somebody who's listening when it comes to, do I stick it out? Do I stay or do I go? Quoting the Clash. What do you think?
Yeah, well, with all the caveats that Mike said around, different people have different situations and obligations that might constrain what you can do. Don't make those bigger than they are. Look at them for what they truly are. But B, I'd say if you can, put yourself in a position to basically take as many chances and try as many things out as you can, because that's where you're going to learn not just new skills and new people, but you're going to learn. You guys were talking about this earlier. You're going to learn what you like, what you don't like, what you can tolerate, who you want to be around. This is going to sound really stupid, but we started watching this show, Myth Quest or Mythic Quest. It's on Apple TV. It's some of the like Always Sunny guys, and it basically takes place at this video game making company, but with the sort of Always Sunny, nothing is off the table. And the whole, it's dumb and it's meant to be a comedy, but it made me realize that I really, really, really miss the first few jobs I worked at that had an extremely informal, young, fun vibe. And it's for the past few jobs, it's been kind of the opposite of that. And I wouldn't necessarily know that if I didn't try out these different jobs. And then now watching this show, it's making kind of nostalgic of an incredibly unprofessional atmosphere, but there's something nice about that too. So my advice would be try different things out and learn as much, not just what you can in terms of what you can use, but learn about yourself.
Well said. Ben, we could do an entire episode on the whole idea about keeping yourself young. Right? Like, how do we, as we get older, keep ourselves young?
Yeah.
Not just physically fit, but mentally, emotionally, like how we've engaged, how we've invested. We should probably definitely do an episode on that, because there are really some tips and tricks around that I think we could share with some people. Mike, final thoughts.
Yeah, on that point, one guy who worked for me a while back accused me of being a millennial trapped in a boomer's body. I would offer 4 things to consider. One is I'm quoting Annie Duke, don't take this like too literally, but create kill criteria.
Mm.
Criteria for when it's time to fold them and walk away. And that pairs up with the second thing, which you've mentioned earlier, Jay, is I've just found it remarkably freeing to be clear on what I value and what I'm willing to tolerate, and write it down before you accept the offer, and then keep that with you throughout your time, and that will be your mind. Now your value, your perception may change, but it's a good anchor. Third thing I would say is get a coach, a quitting coach, or just a coach. Like somebody who, like some people say you got to have your own personal board of advisors or whatever. Oh, whatever. Somebody who you can trust, who's not um, as deeply embedded in it, that can have an honest conversation with you. And in all seriousness, if you need a coach and you can't find one, reach out to me on the Discord. I'm more than happy to be your coach. And then the last one, again, we touched on it earlier, play to win, don't play to lose.
Well said. So I want to thank Mike and Ben for joining us. It's been quite a moment. It's been a minute since we've actually done an episode. I want to, on behalf of Mike, Ben, and myself, I want to thank all of you for tuning in once again. We are back to episodes every other week. Hopefully you're still listening. We got a small dedicated listenership that's still going strong. We are at year, I think this September will be year 9. So thanks those of you who have been around for the whole ride. Hopefully we've gotten better. New episodes every other Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern. Thanks for tuning in, listening. Find us on our Discord. There's a lot of dialogue going on there. Please don't bill yourself as a thought leader on LinkedIn. It's not going to do any favors. And until next episode, it's Jay,
what?
Ben, and Mike saying cheers.